this shirt came from, but I'm here and I'm ready to do a Q&A. First question, why did you arrest me? Asked by Shareth. I was just doing my job, man. I had a temporary posting as a security guard at, what's it called, Blue Scope. Plus, you and that Christopher guy hanging around there look pretty shady, I'm gonna be honest. If you're confused right now, I don't blame you. If you'd like clarification, check out the Port Kembla branch video by Building Beautifully, aka Shareth. I do arrest him in it, and that's actually, I think that video was definitely what tipped me over that 1,000 subscriber mark. So thank you, Shareth, for the shout out and for the fun day filming out and about. All right, another question from Shareth. What got you so into urbanism and active transport in Sydney? This is kind of echoed by a couple of other people. So Matt T asked what first got you interested in urbanism, and Vivian asked why. I don't know what the why was in reference to. I'm just going to group it in with these other questions because it seems close enough. So ultimately, it all kind of came from me moving to Sydney when I was 18 for uni, partially just because I felt like moving to a big city. And then when I got there, I was too young to be eligible for Centrelink. So I tried to get a job, but it took me a while to get stable income. It wasn't until maybe about 4 months into living in Sydney that I had stable income. But in those 3 or 4 months, obviously I couldn't afford to buy a car and run a car, but not as obviously, but just as importantly, I couldn't afford regular public transport use either. So I borrowed a bike from a friend of my dad and used that to ride everywhere. And then once I got regular work and I could afford public transport, I kept riding my bike, A, because I enjoyed it, B, because half the time, depending on where I was going, it was quicker than public transport. C, I still enjoyed saving money because I wasn't exactly rich at that point anyway. It was all those good things that riding a bike brought me that got me really into this urbanism space, because it reaches a point where the only route you can take is either the cracked footpath on the Prince's Highway or an 80km/h underpass under the airport on the M1 where there's no shoulder for you to ride in and you have to be in the middle lane because you're taking the fork to the right after the tunnel ends, that you kind of sit there for a second and you go, actually, this sucks. This is a bad way to build a city. All I want to do is ride my bike from A to B. The distance is not an issue. The hills are not an issue. The only problem that is making this difficult for me is the way that the city has been designed. I eventually discovered all the good cycleways hidden around Sydney. Not necessarily hidden, but they're not obvious in the same way that the arterial roads are obvious. For example, when I rode from the eastern suburbs into the city, I was like, okay, no longer will I take Oxford Street. I'm going to go from Anzac Parade to Burke Street and take Burke and Campbell Street. And then as I was looking more into these side routes and back routes that would be safer, if a little slower and a little less direct, but safer, I ended up finding a lot of excellent cycleways. And then that kind of one thing led to another, and I was like, okay, we should be building these everywhere. We should be improving all the garbage arterial roads that are difficult to ride on. All right, let's address the rest of Shareth's question. What is the top most important thing you want to see change in Sydney? I think ultimately a shift from car-centric planning, i.e. stroads and giant parking lots, to more people-centric development, i.e. wide footpaths, heaps of street trees, cycleways, well-integrated transit-oriented development, that kind of thing. That's kind of what I would like to see happen. What are your plans for future videos? The next video I've got planned is about the Randwick and Kensington tram, and it's going to look into some of the differences between how City of Sydney Council handled the tram and used it to pedestrianise so much of the land around it, and to plant street trees, add street furniture, and then you cross the border to Randwick City Council and pretty much nothing. Gold Coast AU asks, do you think the Colonel Ferry project is worth it. I don't know a lot about this project. When there is metro down there, or potentially an extended light rail, that's when I think it will reach its full potential. I think as it is now, it goes from one tourist spot to another, and it links that up really well. I kind of really like the idea of that ferry as somebody who lives in the eastern suburbs and enjoys visiting the Royal National Park. I think it would be really cool to be able to catch a bus down to La Perouse, hop on the ferry to Cronulla, hop on the ferry from Cronulla to Bundeena, and then walk to the Royal National Park. I think that would be really cool. So I think there's a lot of potential. I think it'll be very useful. I think they just need to make the most of linking it with other forms of public transport on either end. Alright, Jake Adams asks, lots of urbanists seem to demonize highways and cars to the fullest extent possible. So my question is this: how big do you think a city has to be before they need to build a freeway? For example, do you believe Sydney could survive with 0 freeways if we built heaps more trains? What about Beijing or Tokyo? Now, I haven't done a lot of international travel, so I can't really speak to Beijing or Tokyo. So the thing is with freeways in cities is that they should never go to the city centre. The reason for that is because the centre of a city then has to serve two purposes that are completely at odds with each other. The first purpose is the one that centres of cities always have to serve, which is the economic hub of the city. Because it is the place that is accessible from as many different places as possible around the city, it is the place that people go to for concentrated economic activity, right? It's where people work, it's where people shop, it's where people meet up if they're from other sides of the city, and it's where the history of the city tends to be most concentrated. So it's got that economic and that cultural purpose. But when you introduce freeways, it introduces this movement component where people suddenly are moving through the center of the city to get to from one side to the other. And this is completely at odds with the economic and cultural place-centered purposes of the center of a city. The countries that have figured this out, a lot of those being in Europe, but a lot of them I think being in Asia as well, what they do is they have ring roads. They have a ring road around a city, and then they have arterials going towards the center of the city, but never reaching the center of the city. So if you want to go from one end of the city to the other, you drive outside to the city on an arterial road to the freeway, which is in a place where it won't disrupt the important functions of the center of the city. You go around and you go back in to the kind of outskirts or the middle-ish part of the city, but never the center. And if you want to go to the center of the city, that's when you catch public transport, because it doesn't have those massive car parking requirements and it doesn't have those massive space inefficiencies that cars have. Now, you run into problems with this approach when you have a massive sprawling city like Sydney. So if you overlay, for example, Amsterdam onto Sydney, Amsterdam is 800,000 people, it's so much smaller. So basically that shows that the cities with really successful transport networks that don't experience congestion and excessive traffic deaths and excessive poor land use for car parking and things like that, those cities, they deal in smaller units of place. That's why I really like the 3 cities approach that the last government was taking, and I'm a bit disappointed that the Minns government seems to be dismantling it. So that approach was, let's have Sydney, break it down into 3 cities, the Eastern Harbour City, the current CBD, Parramatta, the Central River City, and then the Western Parkland City, Liverpool and Penrith and all those areas. So I think going back to that 3 cities approach and having ring roads around Parramatta, around the Eastern Harbour City, and around the Western Parkland City, aka Liverpool, and having those ring roads going, having arterials that have trams and that have cycleways, towards the center and then having no major roads going through the center of those cities. I think that's the approach to take. So that's a really long answer. It's just a really good question and something I think about a lot. But the answer is yes, freeways, but not inside cities. Freeways around cities. Tom asks, can you write a 2,000-word essay on why we should reopen the Sandown line for passenger services? I've got good news for you, Tom. The Sandown line, at least partially, is currently being turned into the Parramatta Light Rail, and the branch line is being considered for stage 2 of the Parramatta Light Rail. Matt T asks, what do you find most difficult talking about with non-urban enthusiasts? 1, the removal of parking, and 2, increasing density, especially if these people are from the suburbs, and especially if they drive. A lot of people don't realise that the more parking, the more people have to drive, because the more spread out things get. A lot of people also don't realise that if parking is priced properly, it will be available more frequently. Whereas free parking, people just sit in there as long as they want. A lot of the time, though, the fears about parking being removed are justified in certain areas. Not in Sydney, or at least inner Sydney, but in a lot of small regional towns and a lot of suburbia, it's too dangerous to get around by bike, and the public transport isn't frequent or high quality enough to be usable. So parking is the only option for a lot of people. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be able to talk about the removal of parking within the context of introducing better ways to get from A to B. And increasing densities as well. A lot of people get really weird about that. Strangely, I have seen anti-density sentiments being very closely linked with xenophobia. The most common anti-density things I hear are just like random old white men complaining about Asians moving to Sydney. Like the way they talk about it, you'd imagine like Chinese immigrants putting high rises in their backpacks, coming along and putting them down in Sydney, and then that's how the high rises got here. It's happened more than once that people have talked like high rises are just like immigrants from Asia bringing them with them somehow. It's so strange. Like there's this idea that post-war kind of 50s and 60s Australian suburbia is the only acceptable part of the Australian identity to exist, when we kind of have a history, and if you look around inner Sydney you can see this, of building lots of row houses. If you look at the historic town centre of even small towns like Bathurst or Broken Hill, there's multi-storey buildings in the centre of these towns, and then there are suburbs that were low density that are added on, they were added on later. But I think a lot of people have pretty short memories when it comes to history. And I think this idea of Australian suburbia is kind of like a lot of people have incorporated it into their identity as an Australian, when there are so many different Australian identities we could be drawing from that support sensible urbanism. PBQX asks, thoughts on the M4 cycleway? I have not ridden on the M4 cycleway before. I haven't lived west enough to use it. My main thoughts about the M4 cycleway is that it should extend the whole distance of the M4 so that I get a chance to use it. Zachary asks, did you see that comment from the North Sydney councillor? Last time I saw something addressing a comment from a North Sydney councillor, it was this woman saying that she wanted to run school children over and arguing against a zebra crossing being built next to a school. So let's see where this question goes. Did you see that comment from the North Sydney councillor, Julie Gibson? I think this is the same person who wanted to run children over, saying that cyclists think the Harbour Bridge stairs are part of the exercise. I didn't, but I'm not surprised. This leads me to the next question. Why is the North Shore and Northern Beaches seemingly so against cycling and alternative transportation? Love your videos and think we need more content specifically about Sydney's terrible transportation. If you are ever around North Sydney, I'll shout you a beer. Thanks, Zachary. I may just take you up on that offer. But as far as why the Northern Beaches are against cycling and alternative transportation, I don't know for certain. I have never lived in the Northern Beaches. I think a lot of it just comes down to the car creates a paywall to enter this area. I don't want to deal with poor people. Maybe I'm being a bit harsh here, but I think a lot of it comes down to that. Mikado asks, what is your favorite element from the periodic table? This is a pretty basic answer. I'm just going to say carbon. Animals are made of carbon. Plants are made of carbon. Life is made of carbon. Yes, it's going in the atmosphere and warming our planet, but the solution is not getting rid of carbon. It's just taking it out of the atmosphere, putting it in the ground, not in a carbon capture way, just in a tree planting way, in a stopping pollution kind of way. I just like carbon. It's a very important kind of element. Finn asks, favourite Sydney light rail station? Once again, this could be a bit of a basic answer, but I'm going to go with Central Chalmers Street. I like the funny little statues they've got going on. I like the amount of pedestrianisation around there. I like the bike infrastructure around there. I like that it's right next to Prince Alfred Park. I like that it connects really well to Central. I like that it will connect really well to the metro. I don't like that a building caught fire there recently. But yeah, I'd say Central Chalmers Street. Martin asks, what do you think is the biggest issue that the urbanist/new urbanism movement faces? Rich people in low density houses who really like their cars, kind of wielding political influence in the spare time they have because they're retired, in stopping any positive change from happening. And also the lack of funding from the state and federal levels of government. But that kind of interest in good urbanism from the state and federal levels of government, that's changing. We've heard a lot of interesting things from the New South Wales government about lowering restrictions and loosening up zoning a bit. Canberra is very likely going to remove single family zoning in next year if the Labor government gets re-elected, which I think seems pretty likely. Sydney Yimby has recently started, so we're getting organised opposition to these kind of NIMBYs with kind of a lot of financial investment in their property and a lot of emotional investment in their cars. A lot of the big obstacles are kind of being overcome, and I think there are going to be a lot of great changes, a lot of really good big changes in the coming years, coming decades. Darren asks, are you the spoon kid from The Matrix? Darren, I'm going to make you feel old here for a second, mate. I was not alive when The Matrix was being filmed. I was born in 1999, which is when The Matrix came out. Also, do you believe the metro reviews by the New South Wales government are even worth it at this point? Or should the infrastructure just continue, seeing as we won't have the chance to do this again in the future? Insofar as they get us extra metro stations, yes. I think we should get more stations built on the Metro West line, and if the reviews deliver that, great. Ultimately, I think we should just go on with building all of the metro lines that have been planned for, including ones like the Eastern Suburbs line that hasn't even had the business case done yet, I believe. I think we should just get on with all the metro lines that have been planned, but it is important we do them right with a decent stop density. But that's just my opinion. LJ Pickle asks, are you optimistic about Sydney's future in terms of urban design and planning? As I think I made clear by my answer to Martin's question about the obstacles, yes, I'm optimistic. I think Sydney is very much headed in the right direction, and I think all that needs to happen now is for the state and federal levels to release the funding for positive change. Maybe not every, but the vast majority of Sydney councils and a few regional councils have very solid cycling action plans and active transport action plans laid out. Some of them are a bit rubbish, but the vast majority have very solid plans. Then the problem is, the state government doesn't have enough money for them to implement these plans, and it's too busy throwing money to massive roads and tunnels and things like that. So we're kind of having that groundswell proactive transport, pro-housing affordability, density, walkability kind of movement. That's being reflected now in the approach councils are taking, and it's starting to seep into the way the state government runs. But once that kind of tips with the state government allocating lots of funding for this stuff, things will click and I think a lot of positive change will happen really quickly. Like, we've seen a lot of positive change in City of Sydney Council already. That's because it has way more money than like any other council to kind of experiment. It has really strong leadership. Clover Moore is fantastic. There's some kind of leadership in other councils that's like, yeah, let's do these good things, but we don't have the money or we're not quite confident enough to do them. Once that state government money starts pouring in for active transport, things will fall into place. That's what I'm hoping. Ben asks, when did you decide to live car free and what led to that decision? There was not a particular moment where I decided to live car free. I've actually never owned a car. I have my full license. Because I grew up outside of Sydney, I have taught multiple friends who live in Sydney how to drive, but I've never owned a car. When I was a teenager in Queanbeyan, I drove my parents' car around and borrowed that if I needed to go somewhere. When I moved to Sydney, I couldn't afford a car. Part of the reason I moved to Sydney is because I didn't want to have to pay for a car while I was in uni. Property prices may have made up for that, but who knows. As I slowly learned more about city design because I was riding my bike everywhere, outside of the financial and environmental reasons that were already motivating me to not have to own a car, everything else I learned about city design kind of solidified in my brain. I don't want to have to buy a car ever if I don't have to. I'm going to move to Bathurst next year. I'm going to try to live car free there. We'll see how it goes. I'm pretty confident I'll be able to do it. But I think there'll be some interesting videos that I'll be able to make about that experience as well. But I mean, look, if City Nerd can live in Las Vegas without a car, I can live in Bathurst without a car pretty easily, I think. Semois asks, how do we make significant positive change now with everything that is going on in life? Okay, so try to live your life as if the government were already making the right decisions. If you can, bike around. Walk if you can. You know, maybe replace your gym workouts with riding to and from work and you'll end up saving time anyway. And here's what we can learn from the NIMBYs, right? If you design your life so you are invested in good walking infrastructure and good biking infrastructure, then you're going to be more motivated to push for that infrastructure. And it's not going to be something extra. It's going to be like, you're going to be riding, you're going to be like, this is a bad piece of infrastructure. I'm going to send off an email to the councillor or a snap send solve. And if you get in the habit of like, here's something I've spotted, I'm going to shoot off a quick email, I'm going to shoot off a quick snap send solve, and it just becomes part of your daily life, I think that's something you can do that's really good from an urbanist perspective. I like to subscribe to the mailing list of the council's Your Say. That's where you can just respond to surveys about policies the council are getting through. Once you get enough people doing that, the positive change really starts to happen, because on the local council level, they realize, hang on, there are a lot of people who really want this. And then the people on the council who support this have emails they can point to show public support and things like that. A lot of people talk about individual action and voting with your wallet and things like that, and that's all well and good. But that individual action, in my opinion, has to put you in a position to engage politically as well, and has to make that political engagement easy and kind of habitual. And I think that's when things start to get really powerful. So that's the final question. Thank you so much to everyone who sent in a question. If you haven't subscribed already, hit that subscribe button. There are going to be plenty more videos coming out soon, so get excited for that. I'll see you all in the next one. Before I wrap things up, huge thank you to all my Ko-fi supporters: Stuart Vitch, Uxwalia, Abraham N, Building Beautifully, and Lucas. If you want to support my channel, check out my Ko-fi page, link in the description.